Today, we are talking about the woman who was the inspiration of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter. That woman is my 9th great-grandmother. Hello, this is Deborah Carmona here, and I have a special treat for you today because I have a special guest. It is my one and only daughter, Rachel. We are sitting down, enjoying a cup of tea, and join us as we have a little chit-chat. Talking about the book, The Scarlet Letter. This book was written in 1910. It states that Mary Magdalene Bailey Beadle Bachiler Turner was the woman upon whom Nathaniel Hawthorne patterned Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. I find it absolutely fascinating. Famous American author took one of our ancestors and turned it into a novel that everybody talks about, everybody analyzes. There's been so many movies made of it.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That you have an ancestor that was inspired a really popular, famous book.
Yeah. Actually, this book, The Scarlet Letter, this was the book that made him famous.
And The Scarlet Letter was one of the first mass-produced books in the United States.
That's right. Today we are talking about the Mary Magdalene in our family.
Mary Magdalene. So there's a lot of Marys in the Bible, so I did look up to refresh my mind about the Marys, so make sure I didn't get confused with stories. And I found something that was very interesting, so I'm going to read this from Wikipedia. The portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute began in 591 when Pope Gregory I conflated Mary Magdalene, who was introduced in Luke 8, with Mary of Bethany in Luke 10, and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet in Luke 7. Pope Gregory's Easter sermon resulted in a widespread belief that Mary Magdalene was a repentant prostitute or promiscuous woman. Elaborate medieval legends from Western Europe then emerged, which told exaggerated tales of Mary Magdalene's wealth and beauty, as well as of her alleged journey to the southern Gaul. The identification of Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinful woman was still a major controversy in the years leading up to the Reformation, and some Protestant leaders rejected it. During the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church emphasized Mary Magdalene as a symbol of penance. In 1969, Pope Paul removed the identification of Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the sinful woman from the general Roman calendar, but the view of her as a formal prostitute has persisted in popular culture anyways.
So they got the Marys mixed up.
Yes, and I did not know that at all. I feel like my mind is blown because I thought they were the same.
Well, I looked up Mary in the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, and I looked up Mary, and I find a list of the Marys. There's the Mary of Rome, the mother of John Mark, Mary of Bethany, the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary Magdalene. So yes, there are 5 Marys in the Bible. Let me read the section on Mary Magdalene. Her name probably indicates that she came from Magdala on the southwest coast of the Sea of Galilee, after Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. Mark 16:9, Luke 8:2. She became a devoted disciple of his. There is no real ground for thinking that she had been a woman of immoral life.
Okay, wow.
Before Jesus healed her. The only ground for thinking so is the fact that the first mention of her in Luke 8:2 comes immediately after the story of the sinful woman who anointed Jesus. Luke 7:36 and 50. Yes.
Wow, so that confirms what Wikipedia is saying.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Wikipedia got something right.
Look at that.
But the Pope got it wrong.
Yes.
Let me just finish this. She followed the body of Jesus to the grave, Matthew 27:61, and was the first to learn of the resurrection, Matthew 28:1-8, and Mark 16:9, and Luke 24:1 and 10. And nothing is known of her life after Christ's resurrection.
Very interesting.
All this time, I've thought of Mary Magdalene as the adulterous woman.
Yes.
All the time.
I did too.
We've all believed. I guess the church has got it mixed up thanks to that Pope.
Right.
Well,
Pope Gregory.
Well, this is the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, a very reliable source. Yeah, wow. All these years, I have been led to believe that Mary Magdalene of the Bible was an adulterous woman. And now we have just discovered that that is an erroneous teaching. We need to correct the record. You know, it's amazing. When you do some research and you dig into things, you find little nuggets of truth and you find some fascinating details and you get the chance to correct the record. So, announcement to the world, Mary Magdalene's not an adulterer. Don't get the Marys mixed up and confused. But anyways, the Mary Magdalene in our family is an adulterer, and we are going to look at her story. So I got this information off of a genealogy website, and it's labeled this way: is Mary Magdalene Bailey Beadle Bachiler Turner.
Wow, that's a name.
Okay, let me explain. Bailey was actually her maiden name, the name she was given at birth. Beadle was the last name of her first husband, but he died and she became a widow. And while she was a widow, she married Bachiler, and that's our connection.
Right.
That's part of our direct
lineage.
And then Turner was her final husband.
Okay.
While she was married to Mr. Stephen Bachiler, she had an affair with a guy named George Rogers, I think was his name. Their affair became public when Mary became pregnant with his child. So history has tagged her as Mary
as a Magdalene because she had
3 husbands and she was an adulterer.
Except technically unrelated to Magdalene.
Which has been confused by the church.
Wow.
Because of that Pope.
Yes.
I came across something else. It was very interesting as I was searching. I don't know that I've shared this with you, but I actually came across a book online called the Genealogical Dictionary. It lists settlers of New England, and it lists all the names of the first 3 generations of people who settled in the early colonies.
Okay.
Up to the 3rd generation. Before 1692. Does that date ring a bell?
Yes, it does.
That's the date of the Salem witch trials.
Right.
So these are all the people before that time. In that genealogy, I found it even mentioned, this is a genealogy. It just lists who's who they married, who their children were, who their grandchildren were, 3 generations. But even in that dictionary, the genealogical dictionary, it mentions the adulterous affair. There's more confirmation, and that little detail. There's very little details about the different people in this list, but that detail made it into that book as well.
Very interesting.
I found a map of. I was looking up. I was doing some research on the Salem witch trials because we also have a relative that was in the Salem witch trials. And you can find that video. It is The Witch in My Family, if you want to learn more history, which happens to be connected to our family ancestry. But I found a map of Salem, and it put all the people that were involved in the Salem witch trials, and it put them on the map. And there was a certain peninsula in Salem that I saw, hey, that says Bachiler. That's my maiden name. It is my father's name, and then I found out that there was a Bachiler who was on the trial in the Salem witch trials. It's like, wow, I keep finding all these connections of my family, and it kind of all goes back to Salem, Massachusetts. I had no idea that Nathaniel Hawthorne was so connected to my family.
Yeah, I didn't either. Kind of makes the book a little more special to you, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. Because even though Hester Prynne is a fictional character, I'm seeing it through the eyes of my grandmother.
Right.
Even though there's some differences in the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she represents real people that went through that real, actual time.
Where Nathaniel Hawthorne was born, that was his hometown. And because he had his great-great-grandfather, John Hawthorne, was a judge and one of the important judges of the Salem witch trials. That's another connection where Nathaniel was immersed in what happened at Salem, Massachusetts. And there are several references in his fictional novel. There are several references to witchcraft and the spirit realm of demons and witches. Prior to that, I am proud of the fact that both sides of my family were some of the earliest settlers as this country was still in its infancy.
Wow,
America.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And here, we're going to be talking about Mary Bachiler. And she was an adulterous, so...
And her first name was Mary.
History has given her the name of Magdalene, which we know now is wrong.
Is now an incorrect nickname. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Historians in churches, historically, are getting it wrong.
That's so interesting. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I have traced the family history. Let me see, I've got the genealogy here. And here it goes. Let's see. My father, grandfather, okay, so great-grandfather, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. My 9th great-grandfather on my father's side married Mary.
Okay.
Okay.
Your 9th great-grandfather.
My 9th great-grandfather, Bachiler, married Mary. And Mary became the inspiration and the subject of the Scarlet Letter.
The Scarlet Letter. And I have my copy here.
And I have my copy here.
Yes.
And this was a fascinating read.
Yeah.
I enjoyed. Reading the Scarlet Letter really helps you to understand the time in which my great-grandmother lived and the trial that she went through and the public shame. Right. I had to read it in high school. It's in colleges. People love to analyze it because it's a historical representation of early colonial America. And that's why I wanted to read the book. Yeah. To sort of get a feel of what life was like. Right. I like to put myself back into that time and place. And reading that book really did help me to get an understanding.
It does, because we don't have photos and videos of that time period. But books like this, you can imagine the whole thing there. And especially when it's based off of historic time periods and historic people, even if some of the portrayals are fictional, it gives you a really good picture of a time technically not that long ago, but long enough ago that we can't see it for ourselves.
Nathaniel Hawthorne was actually born in Salem, Massachusetts. And he was also interested in family history, and he looked a lot at his own family history, and he found both good and bad about his family history. As a matter of fact, in the first, was it the introduction?
Yeah, the foreword.
The foreword to the book? In the foreword of the book, Nathaniel Hawthorne writes, "But the sentiment has likewise its moral quality. The figure of that first ancestor, invested by family tradition with a dim and dusky grandeur, was present to my boyish imagination. As far back as I can remember, it still haunts me, and induces a sort of home feeling with the past, which I scarcely claim in reference to the present phase of the town. I seem to have a stronger claim to a resident here on account of this grave, bearded, sable-cloaked, and steeple-crowned progenitor, who came to so early with his Bible and his sword. and trod the unworn street with such a stately port, and made so large a figure as a man of war and peace, a stronger claim than for myself, whose name is seldom heard, and my face hardly known. I'm not going to read the whole section, but he's speaking of John Hawthorne, who was a judge.
Right.
And they thought they were doing a righteous thing.
Right. So it's described as he's very holy, but very stern.
Who he was a minister to.
Yeah. I know he was living in that area during the time, but...
How did Hawthorne come upon the story? Well, Captain William Hawthorne, who is an ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, he was rewarded with 870 acres of prime land on the Piscataqua River, which was just 3 farms north of Mary Bachiler.
Okay, so he was like practically their neighbor.
He got this property because of his services for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So he heard it through his father and grandfather, whatever. They heard because everybody, it was the talk of the town.
Right.
This woman, this adulteress.
Yeah. Well, I think that was part of the punishment was the shame. So it had to be talked about. It was they I think announced it so that people would come and gather so that, yeah.
Years later, Nathaniel Hawthorne, noted as an avid scholar of colonial history, he soaked up local history during his extended visits to the Kittery area. His journal does not mention the name of Bachiler, but it does note a young woman doomed to wear the letter A on the breast of her gown under an old colonial law that as punishment for adultery. And so he took her story, our, what did I say, 9th great grandmother, and turned it into a fictional novel.
That's really cool.
When Nathaniel wrote the Scarlet Letter, now at the time, he was working at the Custom House.
Right.
And as you know, the Custom House is the name of the foreword or the introductory chapter to the Scarlet Letter. And so we don't know how much of that chapter is real and how much is fiction.
True.
Because he did have that, and he was privy to information about people because he worked there. He had started writing the novel while he was working there, and I think he worked there for 3 or 4 years, but then he lost his job. And it was during that time when he was out of work working.
Yes.
But when he lost his job, he devoted his time to writing.
Right.
And it was that book that gave him the fame that we know of today.
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah. For him, that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Mary's first husband was Robert Beadle. He was a fisherman out of Kittery, Maine. She married before she turned 20 years old. They made their home in Kittery. She was a church-going woman, and she was active in her community. They were married for 5 years, and they had 2 children, Christopher and Elizabeth. Robert died, presumably lost at sea, leaving her to be a widow with 2 children. On Valentine's Day in 1648, his property became her property. So, and she had to fight for that property, even though she was a widow. Later, Stephen Bachiler sold the Beadle property to Peter Staples, which would be Peter Staples married Elizabeth years later. The child was not the daughter of Reverend Stephen Bachiler, but that she came from the affair that Mary had with George.
So I didn't actually finish the story yet. I didn't quite have time. I understand the whole story because I did sort of look it up and get the general plot so I understand. And then you've told me some about our history, but can you tell me like what's fact and what's fiction? What are the differences there?
But yeah, there's definitely some differences. There's some similarities too. And I can see where Nathaniel, got his ideas. The big difference is Hester Prynne had a adulterous relationship with the preacher. And I'm sure he did that because it'd be much more scandalous.
Right. So that's the fictional part.
That's the fiction. Okay. The truth is she was married to a preacher.
Oh, okay.
And she had an affair while married to the preacher.
I see.
That's the big
So they
difference.
kind of swapped those two things.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Hester was a victim of Puritan intolerance in Boston. But the story actually, the real story, the truthful story, actually happened in Kittery, Maine. Both women did go through public shame. Both women were strong, self-reliant, and iron-willed, but with different styles. Mary was very outspoken. She was somewhat of a battler. She was a fighter. She was active in community affairs. She was aggressive in managing her estate and in seeking a husband. Hester, on the other hand, was quiet, reserved, accepting her penance of loneliness, gracefully apart from the village in an isolated cottage, graciously defiant with her aristocratic bearing, calmness of speech, and pride in self-support from her needlework. Both women won the community respect, but in different ways. And I'm not 100% sure about the branding, because I've only found one person who, on some blog, who claimed that she was actually branded.
Okay.
The hot iron.
Like actually on her
like
chest.
Brand, yeah. That's like a permanent mark.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true, because I've only seen that one place. I have not been able to verify it anywhere else.
Okay.
The court at York, Maine, delivered the following verdict. It is ordered that Mrs. Bachiler, for her adultery, shall receive 40 stripes save one at the first town meeting held at Kittery, 6 weeks after her delivery, and be branded with the letter A. So it may be the way that Nathaniel Hawthorne describes it in his book. In that book, the genealogies, it said she was whipped.
Right. Okay.
And that's what I have read many times in multiple sources, that she was whipped.
Okay.
Wow.
Wow.
And that's, when you see it in various other sources, that's what I would tend to believe.
Yeah, and I do know that that was a common punishment in the time for other offenses.
But in the book, she had to wear a letter A on her clothes to identify her. And I just love the way Nathaniel Hawthorne used that letter. It feels like a heavy weight.
Right.
And it feels like it's burning into her soul. And it's a reminder of her shame and her sin. But at the same time, I'm like, so nobody else is a sinner? I mean, is this sin so far worse than so many other sins?
Right.
They're not guilty?
Yeah.
And why don't they have to suffer eternal punishment? I mean, goodness.
It must be that they have like a hierarchy of sins, and their sins were maybe lesser. All they had to do was pray.
Yes, they actually did think that adultery was a great sin.
Right, okay.
So reading this book kind of takes you back to colonial America. Get a feel of what life was like, what everyday life was like. To understand what Mary went through, her inner turmoil, her inner shame and public shame, and it went on for years. And she was branded with the letter A. Nathaniel Hawthorne says that Hester Prynne had to wear a embroidered scarlet letter on her breast. It's seemingly for life, I don't know, that the embroidered A would be more out in the public. If it's on her flesh, that she's going to, cover it up and not have it be seen to everybody. Great.
I thought it was really interesting the part where she first comes out of the jail cell with her letter A, and the way that, the crowd is there to watch. I thought it was really interesting, the descriptions, and there was still this like jealousy from all the other women about how good her A looked. And she doesn't actually look as ugly. She didn't look ugly, even though she was in jail and had to change her appearance and stuff. Like, there was still, like, why does she still look good? This is supposed to be a punishment, and look at her. There was a little bit of that.
Yeah, Nathaniel had her be in a marvelous needlework,
Right.
and embroidery, and so she could wear it with elegance. Okay, if this is going to be my mark, I'm going to wear it.
If I'm going to wear it, I'm going to wear it well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not come across any information about Mary being skilled in embroidery or in lace making the way Hester. But another similarity where Hester Prynne and Mary Bachiler are very much alike is they both had a ministering spirit visiting the sick or those who were grieving. At that time, Mary was a single mother, a widow with 2 children, and she needed to find a way to support the needs of her children. By becoming a housekeeper for Stephen Batchelder, it was a way of making ends meet, who only lived 2 farmsteads below her. So this is how she came to be connected to Reverend Stephen Batchelder. She lived the true story, not the fiction. She lived nearby to the Batchelors, the proper two neighbors down, but she did live nearby. It is really unclear if he asked her to do this job or if someone recommended her. Stephen was 85 or 87 years old. She was in her 20s, 25 to 27. One record states that he was 60 years her senior. So if she was 27, he was 87. He's an old man, okay? And she's a neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to his house and she cooked for him and cleaned for him, and she was doing neighborly things for him. 80-something, a widower. She was 20-something and a good neighbor. And here she is, a single mom with 2 children that she's trying to raise money for. And they're not married at this time, okay? They're just neighbors. She's just doing a good deed. This is the reality, not the fiction. But the ladies,
indecent.
Oh my goodness, here's this 20-something lady spending all this time at a 80-year-old man's house. What are they doing? I mean, you could just imagine women talking.
Yes, you can.
Oh no, there's this young lady spending all this time with that old man. Oh, that's so wrong. That's so inappropriate. They must be married. And so word got around and it got to the authority. This is improper. This is improper for a young woman to be spending so much time at this old man's house. Why would a young woman seek a relationship with an old man? Well, that talk got all the way up to the governor. Mm-hmm. I came across a letter. Let me see if I have it. A letter that he wrote. Okay, here is a letter that Stephen Batchelder penned to Governor Winthrop. And it's obvious from this letter that we could tell that he was a friend of the governor's. And I believe he wrote this to try to explain things, because the gossip, was passing around town. So this is what he writes. And whereas, by appropriation of the whole plantation of Strawberry Bank, they have assigned who? I'd like to know who assigned. They have assigned an honest neighbor, a good neighbor, an honest neighbor, talking about Mary, a widow, to have some eye and care towards my family for washing, baking, and other such common services. It is a world of woe to think that rumors, detracting spirits raise up, and I am married to her, or certainly shall be. I think that's what the gossip was. Is he married to her? They're going to get married. Because you can't be, I'm soon to be married, or I am married. So it hasn't happened yet. So he's explaining, I think he's explaining the rumors. That I am married to her, or certainly shall be, and cast on her such aspirations without ground or proof, that I see not how possibly I shall subsist in the place. He wasn't really happy about being forced to marry, and he didn't want to live with her.
Right.
So he moves into his son's house to live with, to do them that service from which otherwise they cannot endure to hear. I shall depart. The Lord direct and guide us jointly and singularly in all things to his glory and our rejoicing in the day and at the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ. So right there, his own hands. He's not happy about this. He doesn't want this. And so he's already made up his mind. I'm leaving. They were commanded to get married.
Wow. All because of talk and speculation by other people.
It wasn't a romantic relationship.
Okay.
They were forced into this. And here's some interesting details about that marriage. He, being a preacher, conducted the marriage himself.
Oh?
And he failed to record it. And he was charged a marriage without banns. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means. Did that mean there were no rings?
Like wedding bands? Yeah, like...
I'm not sure. So, a secret marriage, as the genealogy book says, secret wife. A secret marriage without banns. He didn't record it. He did it himself. So, there were no witnesses.
Yeah.
Did the marriage exist?
Ooh. Oh, no.
Well, it does, because they did try to file for divorce.
Okay.
Both she tried to file for divorce later, and he tried to file for divorce later. The Reverend himself appealed for divorce, but the courts would not grant him that because he had been a thorn in their side for a while now. When the Massachusetts court denied his request, he was likely frustrated. And then all this scandal with Mary's affair. So in 1653, he went back to England to live with one of his children. They had prospered and they had space, and so they would take care of him for the remainder of his life. Okay, so this young woman, first of all, she was a widow herself, and she had 2 children from her first husband who died. So they didn't live together.
Right.
So this couple that were forced to marry, this 27, I don't know, she was in her 20s, and he is in his 80s. They were forced to get married. She didn't want it, he didn't want it. He moves out. So, and it was kind of a secret marriage.
Yeah.
Questionable if there really was a marriage.
But did they, do that to appease the people, I guess?
They did.
Okay.
So, I guess legally they were married.
Right.
But think about the Bible's description of marriage.
Right.
It's when a man and a woman become one.
Right.
And they have a relationship, an intimate relationship.
Mm-hmm.
There's no evidence.
Sound like they really had that.
I think it was legally married, but not a real marriage.
Yeah.
I don't think they ever consummated the marriage.
Probably not, yeah.
There was no intimacy. There was no romance. Forced upon her by the talk, the gossip, society.
So it's it makes you wonder if they regretted doing that for the sake of other people.
But then they turn around and scorn her for her adulterous affairs. Someone said this. Stephen left after discovering his wife's true nature. No, I don't believe that. I think, based on his own words from the letter he wrote to the governor, that he just didn't want to be forced into this relationship. So he left. On April 9th of 1650, the Reverend was fined £10 by the court of Salisbury for not publishing his marriage according to the law. And it was further ordered that he and Mary, regardless of the legitimacy of the alleged marriage, should live together as they agreed, or they would face a fine of £50 each. When do you have to order a husband and wife to live together? You have to live together.
So weird.
And they had to pay a fine. So, Okay, let's get back to George Rogers and Mary's relationship. While Mary was working for Mr. Bachiler in what appears to be a non-existent marriage, she moves out and she falls in love with another seaman who was closer to her age, who lived in Kittery, just across the river from Strawberry Bank. She had an affair with George Rogers, the neighbor. Well, she became pregnant, and the pregnancy was the telltale sign.
So that was sort of the final straw of the public of like, see, we told you she was that kind of woman.
Yeah.
Here she is pregnant.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been an affair if she wasn't forced to marry that man in the first place, though. It would have just been a regular relationship.
Oh, they weren't married. So later that same year, at the York County, Mary Bachiler and her next-door neighbor, George Rogers, were charged with living in one house together and lying in one room. And so she moved in with George Rogers.
Right.
The affair became public in 1651 when Mary became pregnant with his child. And I say his child. Everybody else says his child. The child may bear the name of Bachiler, but nobody that I read will believe that this 87-year-old man was the father of that child. Nobody believes it. He's not the father of that child.
No. So her child then came from that man that was in her life for a short bit, but then he disappeared.
Right. Even though Mary did give the last name Bachiler to the child. By the way, the child that she had from the adulterous affair was also named Mary. Mary Bachiler was her name. She was named after Stephen Bachiler, even though he's not the father of the child. And they were convicted of adultery. And I think that was October 1651. George, he was whipped 39 times.
Wow.
Probably was public. I'm not sure about that.
Right.
And then he disappears off the scene. So
he was like, no more of that.
Because I couldn't find much more information about him after this. I was like, well, what happened to him? Why did he leave her with a child?
I guess he just felt like his reputation was ruined, so I guess he was like, I will make a life somewhere else and leave her too.
He was gone. The court at York, Maine delivered the following verdict. We do present George Rogers and Mary Bachiler, the wife of Mr. Stephen Bachiler, minister, for adultery. It is ordered that Mrs. Bachiler, for her adultery, shall receive 40 stripes save one at the first town meeting held in Kittery 6 weeks after her delivery, and she must be branded with the letter A. 1 year later, October 14, 1652, Mary was charged by the Kittery District Court for entertaining idle people on the Sabbath.
What? They were after her.
She had tried to get a divorce. He had tried to get a divorce. It wasn't happening. Okay, Stephen had been gone for 4 years. During that time, she met and fell in love with Thomas Turner.
Okay.
Became her eventual husband. Thomas was a laborer for the Handsome shipyard at Kittery, and he wanted to marry her, but because she was legally married to Reverend Bachiler, who's now back in England.
Right.
And he went there for the remainder of his life. And so she wanted to get a divorce. You know, we mentioned she was married to a seaman. She fell in love with another seaman. She had an affair with a seaman. She eventually married a guy who worked at a shipyard. Are you getting the picture that Kittery, Maine is a seaport? It is. I used to live in that area. I used to sit on the banks and sketch. You know, I'm sitting here quietly just sketching, and it's a big wide river. And you remember that bridge? That big bridge that crosses from New Hampshire to Maine? I'm just sitting there quietly sketching, and all of a sudden the water went whoosh. Oh, and around the bend came this big old tanker ship. And two little tugboats on each side. I actually have a sketch of that in my sketchbook, that moment. But yeah, there's a lot of ships and boats coming in and out of there. It's a very wide river. That's why the bridge is so high, so the ships can pass underneath. I've actually been to a certain, I don't know, event or a holiday when there were a bunch of sailboats and ships just filled the whole area. It's a pretty cool place. He filed for divorce. She filed for divorce. The courts wouldn't have it. And she wasn't getting her divorce. But now she's in love with Thomas Turner.
Okay.
And she's got actual romance. If the other guys didn't exist,
Yeah.
and if she had just married Thomas Turner,
right,
we'd have never ever heard about her. We
yeah.
wouldn't be able to find the history about her.
And probably this book wouldn't be written.
And this book wouldn't be written. Yeah. So it's interesting. You know, the people who stand out in history are the ones who do something horrible.
It does seem to be that way.
Yeah. And the people who just live normal
average lives, status
nobody
quo.
ever knows who they are.
You forget who they are. They're a name listed somewhere.
It wasn't until Mary went to the court at Boston to plead her case for divorce that her petition was granted. Prior to, she was going to the local courts. So eventually, she, she's pleading. Okay, but now she's got 2 kids, and she's a single mom, and her husband has left, and
Okay.
So here's a woman. She's got 3 kids, and now her kids are sick, and she goes to the courts and she begs and pleads her humble petition.
Do you want me to read it?
Not the whole thing, but
okay.
What I got highlighted.
The humble petition of Mary Bachiler. Whereas your petitioner, having formerly lived with Mr. Stephen Bachiler, a minister of this colony, as his lawful wife, and not unknown to divers of you as I convince, and the said Mr. Bachiler upon some pretended ends of his own, hath transported himself unto Wood, England, for many years since, and betaken himself to another wife, as your petitioner hath often been credibly informed, and there continueth, whereby your petitioner is left destitute, not only of a guide to her own children, but also made uncapable thereby of disposing herself in the way of marriage to any other, without a lawful permission, and having now 2 children upon her hands that are chargeable unto her in regard to a disease God hath been pleased to lay upon them both, which is not easily curable, and so weakening her estate in prosecuting the means of cure, that she is not able longer to substitute without utter ruining her estate. Wow. Let's see. And were she free from her engagement to Mr. Bachiler, might probably so dispose of herself as that she might obtain to meet help to assist her to procure such means for her livelihood and the recovery of her children's health as might keep them from perishing. Wow.
So her kids were sick.
Yes.
And she did gain some property from her former husband.
Yeah.
And she didn't want to have to sell it off to get the medical care she needed for her sick kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so she pleaded with the court. In her plea, she made claim that Stephen had taken another wife in England. There's no record of that, and the family denies it. Of course, his family didn't have the best opinion of Mary, having learned of the scandal and of the adulterous affair. I can't help myself. I can't help my children.
Right.
My kids are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Please, give me this divorce. But also, she pled. She said, I don't want to become a ward of the state. I don't want to become a charity case.
Right.
Let the state of Maine, because that's the jurisdiction that had her, because this happened in southern part of Maine.
Okay.
Let Maine have its freedom. I don't want to have to be a burden to the state.
Right.
Let me provide for my own family. Give me this divorce so that I can marry Mr. Turner.
Right.
But she was able to finally get her divorce after her very humble plea. And the court gave her her divorce.
Okay, that's good.
But shortly, very shortly afterwards, Stephen Bachiler died just 17 days after Mary's divorce was granted.
Oh,
He died anyways if she'd only waited just a couple more weeks, she'd have been free anyways. He'd have been dead anyways, and she'd have been free, but whatever. Nothing came easy to her.
Wow.
So she got her divorce, and then she married Mr. Turner and lived happily ever after.
Finally.
But there's more.
There's more.
There's more. Very little is known about how Mary overcame ridicule, scorn, and public shame. Most people don't know this part of her story. But Mary, she had risen above her shame, all the shame she went through. Only woman among 40 leading male citizens that signed the Certificate of Submission on November 16th, 1652. She rose so much to respectability and prominence that she was the only woman among 40 men who had her name signed on the document.
Wow. That's really cool.
That document, which was endorsed under threats by the stronger Puritan government of Massachusetts to use its militia unless Maine succumbed peacefully, turned Maine over to the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Maine was not to regain its independence until 1820. That Mary was chosen to inscribe the treaty is some indication of her stature in the community. She penned her own signature, and only about half of the subscribers could even do that. They didn't know how to write their own name. That also connects my history.
Yes.
Massachusetts, Maine, where most of my family lives.
That is so interesting.
A woman who overcame,
Yeah.
which is just like Hester Prynne
Right.
in the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
An overcomer. They endured, both women endured so much shame and scorn.
So, like, even though there are some differences, it's like the idea is the same struggle, even if there's some differences there. Very, very positive and exciting to hear that she had a good ending.
Yes. Her daughter
Yeah.
married a young man, and they moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which I used to live there. I'm very familiar with it. And they became an active church-going family and lived a very normal life.
Good.
And for the rest of her days, she lived a peaceable life in respectability. I love stories of people who overcome difficulties.
Yes. Yeah, and especially for women back in that day, it was even harder for them to get the things that they needed.
Yes.
Yeah, independent women that's not a normal thing. You have to be dependent on a man.
Yeah, she had to fight. She had to go to court and fight to get her deceased husband's property. And Stephen was, even though, that affair, and it was, not much of a marriage.
Right.
He did pass on some property to her daughter. Oh. But Mary achieved her goals. She got a divorce. She gained a husband more her age. She saw 2 daughters, married well, and she conserved her estate, which she was able to pass on to her son-in-law, Peter Staples, who married her daughter Elizabeth. A book published at the time of the Eliot Centennial in 1910 states that Mary Bachiler was the woman upon whom Hawthorne patterned the heroine of the Scarlet Letter. And also, this is cool, the description of Hester Prynne's cottage closely parallels that of Mary on what was to become the Staples property.
That is just so cool.
The evidence is strong that Hester Prynne was a character derived from Hawthorne's extensive knowledge of the history of Kittery in colonial times. I love stories like that.
Well, I will definitely enjoy continuing to read this because, it's my type of story anyways. I just find it very interesting, but it makes it that much more intriguing to, understand that, the character in here was somebody that's, related to us by marriage.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
First time I went, I had no idea at that time that I had any connection at all to Salem, Massachusetts. That there was such a connection to my family.
Yeah.
In more ways than one. I have found at least 4 family connections.
I mean, I guess it makes sense. Like it's a nearby, vicinity, and you already knew that your family had been in America since basically the beginning. So it makes sense.
Actually, I just learned it.
Gotcha.
And I toured all the monuments. I did a video about that. And it was after that trip that I learned, because I stopped in Salem, Massachusetts, but for not to look at that history, but to look at the history of Roger Williams, from preaching, the first Baptist preacher in America, and he got banned by the church in Salem.
Oh, okay.
That's why I went to Salem.
Oh.
And I had no idea. And guess what? Stephen Bachiler is connected to that story too. I can't believe how many connections I am finding with all of this. I love studying history. And right now, because of all of the research that I've been doing, I am most fascinated with colonial history because it's related to American history. And it's part of all of us Americans. It's part of our history. When we look back at the people who lived and the struggles they faced and the trials and even what Mary went through, what Hester Prynne went through, we can learn so many valuable lessons about that history, and we need to learn so that we don't repeat the mistakes made from those of the past. It's just fascinating.
Very fascinating.
Family history is fascinating. American history is fascinating.
Yes.
And I just love stories of people.
Yeah, and I think there's really important lessons to be learned in those types of stories from time past. I know even the little bit that I had read so far, I was like, this sounds familiar, as in recent times familiar. It's like different aspects, but same principle of like the ideas of things that are happening in culture. It's very interesting.
This book is a part of American history, and that's why it's studied in schools, colleges, universities. Mary was the victim of Puritan intolerance. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, their dream was that Massachusetts was going to be the city on a hill, that it was going to be the example for the whole nation to follow. The leadership of that were all Puritans. It was their dream to create a moral, pure society. So I'm going to expand a little bit more on this idea of what the Puritan religion was and its effect on society, what the original dream of it was, and what its goal was, and how it actually fueled a fight that would reshape the colonies, which would eventually shape the United States. So I will go into that more as I cover Roger Williams' story, Stephen Bachiler's story, and part 2 of The Witch in My Family. All these stories are connected, and they're all, the Puritans are right in the middle of it. So if you want to understand more about that part of the story, please subscribe to my channel, because I have more stories which are also ancestral stories from my family, which are probably connected to a whole lot of you too, because the further back you go, the more joined we all are. The Puritans further believed that their ways were higher than anyone else. Yeah, the Puritans thought that they were next to God, They are doing everything right. They're being so holy and so righteous, and they really had a very high mind of themselves. And the Bible speaks against that too. They thought they were doing God's work, and that's why they punished people for lying, stealing, adultery, whatever. They had strict rules, and they tried to force it upon the people. And everybody that was a part of their community, it was a covenant community. They all had to try to live up to the standard norms. They're basically adding man's ideas on top of God's word instead of just living God's truth. Anytime that man strays away from the actual biblical principles, or if you add something to God's word, they're wrong. They err. In essence, they were violating God's order of things. Anytime anything is added to God's word, it's unbiblical and it's wrong. And that was the big mistake of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It kind of didn't work out the way they planned. So if you want to learn more about that, please subscribe to my channel and you will find all of these historical stories under my playlist, Stories from History. So yeah, all the mistakes that the Massachusetts Bay Colony made and the Puritans made, it created a revolt that would lead eventually to the American Revolution. It all fed into it. Of course, you know, the American Revolution led to America being free country, separate from the authority of England and the king and the crown. And sadly, it looks like today we have lost that and we need to get it back. We need to study our history. We need to understand our history. We need to understand our roots so that we can figure out a way to get America back to what it was intended to be from the beginning. Not the Puritan way, because that just led to so many problems. And this story shows us some of the failings and the faults of this religious community that was trying to force their religion. You don't force religion, okay? You don't force religion. It doesn't work that way. We need biblical principles, and we need to have a right relationship with God. And that relationship is personal. It's between God and me, not anybody else. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. These people, you know, the judges and the magistrates and the governors, they thought they were doing God's work and they were God's ministers and they were controlling. Even the ministers, some of the problems of the ministers, they were in it for the wrong reason. They weren't there to serve God. They were just there to serve themselves. And they liked the power and the control, and it all backfired. Because you know what? The human spirit yearns to be free. We don't want to be oppressed. You just look around the world today. We've got protests and eruptions happening around the world because people want to be free. They don't want an oppressive government holding them back, crushing them, draining the life out of them. The human spirit wants to be free. And anybody who actually studies the Bible and applies biblical principles, and they will understand that that's what God wants for us too. He wants us to have liberty. He wants us to have freedom. And it doesn't come by force. It doesn't come by oppression. It doesn't come by walking on other people's rights. So this is why we need to learn our history. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you enjoyed this. And like I said before, if you are interested in history, historical, ancestral stories from history, please subscribe to my channel. I have lots more stories to bring, and please leave a comment. Tell me what you learned from this video. And so I try to cover all the bases, but I might have skipped something, or it's possible I might have made an error. Sometimes you read different accounts and you get this information, it doesn't quite line up. So I try to sift through it and try to figure out the most sensible, logical conclusion. I welcome your comments and questions if you have any, and if I have the answer. I don't know everything. Your question might cause me to dig into and find out something else. Or maybe you have some information I haven't come across yet that you could share. Appreciate you watching, and give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Thanks for watching. Well, they say. But there's a whole story in Stephen Bachiler. And I have a cat problem. I forgot something. I gotta go in there with the cats. Mary was the victim of Puritan intolerance. Let me do that again. I am surrounded with notes. I have papers and papers and files of notes. I'm just getting lost with all of this. Am I recording? I am recording, okay. You know, get that last one. You might have to do
Let's
it.
just pretend we did get it.
How many times? This is totally unrehearsed.
As you can tell.